The Keth Dominion had been watching humanity for a long time. Not with fear, not with respect. They watched the way a man watches a small fire in the rain, curious if it would die on its own, or if it needed to be stamped out. The Keth were old, older than most species in the known galaxy. They had built their first starships when humanity was still drawing pictures on cave walls. They had fought wars that lasted centuries, swallowed entire civilizations into their dominion, and emerged larger and stronger each time. By the time they turned their full attention to the small, wet, noisy species orbiting a yellow star in the outer spiral arm, the Keth had already conquered 117 worlds. They were not worried about number 118. The first contact between humanity and the Keth had happened 11 years before the war. A human exploration vessel, the GES Ardent, had drifted too close to a Keth patrol zone near the Gravenmoor Nebula. Gravenmoor was a dense cloud of gas and dust roughly 40 light-years wide, sitting at the edge of what both species were quietly expanding toward. The Keth called it the Velthara Shroud. Humanity called it Gravenmoor because the first scientist to map it, Dr. Elena Gravenmoor, had spent 3 years charting its edges from a small research station, and had named it herself before anyone could stop her. The patrol that intercepted the Ardent was not aggressive. The Keth commander had allowed the human crew to speak, mostly out of amusement. He had reviewed the ship's specs, a mid-range exploration vessel, armed with light defensive weapons, crewed by 41 humans and 2 robotic systems. He had then looked at his own fleet of 600 warships patrolling that sector alone, and he had laughed. The word had spread quickly through Keth Command: humanity, a species with a single inhabited star system, a handful of colony worlds, and a navy that the Keth fleet analyst called, in an official report, adequate for policing minor disputes. That report had become something of a joke among Keth admirals. They passed it around at gatherings. They referenced it in speeches. Adequate for policing minor disputes. It became the phrase they used whenever humanity came up in conversation. The 11 years that followed were not peaceful, but they were not quite war either. The Keth expanded steadily toward the Gravenmoor Nebula from one side. Humanity expanded toward it from the other. There were incidents, small ones. A Keth supply convoy harassed a human mining operation. A human survey team was detained at a Keth checkpoint and held for 19 days before being released. 3 human listening posts went dark in 1 week, officially attributed to equipment failure, though everyone knew better. Humanity lodged formal complaints through the Galactic Mediation Council. The Keth sent polite responses and changed nothing. The council itself was less than useless. It was an old institution, built in an era when there were a dozen species powerful enough to need a table to sit at. Now the Keth dominated it. They had seats, allies, and influence on every committee. When humanity raised its hand and spoke, the chamber listened, and then the Keth spoke, and everyone nodded and moved on. This is the part that Ambassador Rena Voss never forgot. She had been the human representative to the Galactic Mediation Council for 4 years when the war started. She was 47 years old, tall, with gray already threading through her dark hair, and she had sat in that chamber and watched the Keth laugh at humanity more times than she could count. Not always openly. Sometimes it was the way their lead diplomat, a long-limbed creature named Velthar Kos, would pause after a human statement, just a fraction too long, before responding, as if he was letting the silence do the work, as if he wanted the room to feel the gap between what humanity claimed and what humanity was. She had sat there and kept her face calm and made her arguments and filed her protests and come away with nothing each time. Back on Earth, people debated. Some said humanity should be more aggressive. Some said it should be more diplomatic. Some said it should be patient, that time was on humanity's side, that the Keth would eventually push too far and the rest of the galaxy would push back. The debates were long and passionate and mostly irrelevant, because while humanity debated, the Keth were not debating at all. They were building. The Keth 11th Grand Fleet had been under construction for 6 years before most of humanity's intelligence services knew it existed. It was massive, not the kind of fleet that patrols borders or escorts convoys. It was the kind of fleet that ends things. When the final count was confirmed by a human deep-cover intelligence asset who transmitted a single compressed data burst before going silent, The number sent a chill through every military analyst who read it. 11,214 warships. The 11th Grand Fleet was not built to intimidate. The Keth had never needed that many ships to intimidate anyone. It was built to crush, completely and permanently, a single target. And the target was obvious. Humanity had been the last piece of resistance, the last species still loudly objecting, still filing complaints, still refusing the Keth's very politely worded offers to integrate into the Dominion under favorable terms. The terms were not favorable. They never were. The declaration of war, when it came, was formal and brief. It arrived through official Galactic Council channels, transmitted to Ambassador Voss at her office on the Council station. She read it 3 times. Then she called the Undersecretary of Defense on a secure line and told him what was coming. She remembers that the Undersecretary was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "How long do we have?" She said, "Weeks, maybe a month, if they're being careful about fuel logistics." Another silence. Then, "We'll need to brief the President." "Yes," she said, "you will." She did not tell him what she was really thinking, which was that 11,000 ships was not a fleet. It was a statement. The Keth were not sending that fleet because they thought humanity would fight back effectively. They were sending it because they wanted the rest of the galaxy to see what happened when you kept saying no to the Dominion for too long. They were sending it to make an example. The news broke publicly 4 days later. The reaction on Earth and the colony worlds was immediate and loud. Fear, anger, disbelief, and something else. A stubborn, grinding fury that ran under everything else like a current. Humans were, as a species, not particularly graceful about being told what they could not do. They did not respond well to being underestimated, and the Keth, for all their intelligence and experience, had made one significant error in their centuries of building an empire. They had never actually fought humans before. They had read the reports. They had analyzed the GES Ardent specs and the human navy's known capabilities and the colony world's defensive installations. They had run the numbers through models that had correctly predicted the outcomes of 43 separate conflicts involving other species. The models all said the same thing. The human resistance would collapse within 60 to 90 days of first engagement. 60 to 90 days. Fleet Admiral Mira Tanaka read that estimate in the intelligence briefing, and then set it aside. She was a small woman with short-cropped hair and very dark eyes that gave nothing away. She had spent 30 years in the human navy, had fought in 2 smaller conflicts, and had spent the last 8 years working on exactly this problem. What to do if a major power decided to bring overwhelming force against humanity. She had not been popular for it. When you spend 8 years planning for a war that most people think will never happen, you develop a reputation. Some called her paranoid, some called her a warmonger. When she submitted budget requests for new shipyards, for deep space supply caches, for weapons programs that were officially described as research projects but were very obviously not, she got half of what she asked for and was told to be grateful for it. She had been grateful. She had also quietly done more with the half than most people could have done with the whole. The day the declaration of war arrived, Fleet Admiral Tanaka was already at her command center on Titan Station. She had been there for 6 days, because her own intelligence contacts had given her a slightly earlier warning than the official channels. She had used those 6 days well. She had also, on the morning of the 3rd day, placed a quiet personal call to Ambassador Voss. "They're going to laugh," Tanaka had said without preamble. Voss, who was already exhausted and had not slept properly in 2 days, rubbed her eyes. "I know." "Let them," Tanaka said. "Every hour they're laughing is an hour they're not thinking." Voss had looked at the fleet numbers on the display in front of her. 11,000 ships. What are we thinking? Tanaka had paused, and when she spoke, her voice was steady and calm, in a way that Voss would later describe as either terrifying or reassuring, depending on the day. "We're thinking about Gravenmoor." The Gravenmoor Nebula was not the obvious place to make a stand. Most of the military theorists who publicly debated humanity's strategic situation focused on the defended colonies, on the transit corridors, on the orbital installations around Earth and Mars, and the major population centers. These were the places that made sense to defend. These were the places that mattered. But Tanaka was not interested in defending what mattered. She was interested in destroying what the Keth could not afford to lose. Gravenmoor was 40 light-years wide and 3 light-years deep, a churning mass of ionized gas and dust that played havoc with sensors at any distance beyond a few thousand kilometers. Inside the nebula, long-range targeting was nearly useless. Communication between ships was difficult. Navigation required close attention and constant correction. In short, it was a terrible place to fight a battle. Unless, of course, you had spent the last 8 years quietly placing things inside it. The Keth 11th Grand Fleet launched from the staging point near the Keth border world of Tessavar on the 14th day after the declaration of war. Velthar Kos, who was also a senior fleet coordinator in addition to his diplomatic role, personally oversaw the deployment. He stood on the command deck of the flagship, the Eternal Dominion, and watched the holographic display as 11,000 ships formed up into their attack formation. It was a beautiful sight, he thought, the kind of sight that ended arguments. He had a speech prepared for when they reached the human systems. He had spent time on it. It was a good speech. The fleet moved through jump space in coordinated waves. The Keth had perfected coordinated fleet jumps over centuries of practice. They arrived at the edge of human-claimed space exactly on schedule, exactly in formation, exactly as planned. They were met by a human broadcast signal, not a military channel, but an open frequency that any ship in range could receive. The voice that came through was calm, almost friendly. "This is Fleet Admiral Mira Tanaka of the Terran Defense Force. You have entered human sovereign space. You are advised to reverse course immediately. This is your only warning." Velthar Kos listened to the message. He waited until it finished. Then he turned to his communications officer and said, very calmly, "Send her this. We have 11,000 ships. How many do you have?" The response came back in 40 seconds. "Enough." Kos looked at the word on his display for a moment. Then he laughed. The bridge crew laughed with him. The laughter went out over the internal channel to the officers aboard the flagship, and from there spread, as laughter does, from ship to ship, from deck to deck, through 11,000 vessels carrying 500,000 Keth warriors who had spent years preparing for exactly this moment. They laughed at Gravenmoor. They laughed because they had 11,000 ships and humanity had, according to the best intelligence available, fewer than 800. They laughed because they had done this before, dozens of times, against species that had been larger and more powerful and better prepared, and the ending was always the same. They laughed because they were certain. And certainty, in war, is the most dangerous thing in the universe. Tanaka heard the laughter through the open channel. She was standing in a command room deep inside Titan Station, surrounded by screens and officers, and the quiet hum of systems that had been running for 6 days without pause. She listened to the laughter until it faded. Then she turned to her Chief of Operations, Commander Yusuf Adesanya, and said 2 words. Phase 1. Adesanya relayed the order. It traveled at the speed of light through quantum-encrypted channels to 47 locations scattered across the outer edges of the Gravenmoor Nebula. The Keth fleet was still moving when the first signals came back. Not explosions, not weapons fire. Something the Keth tactical systems could not immediately identify. A pattern of electromagnetic pulses from inside the nebula, timed and sequenced in a way that did not match any known weapon signature. The fleet's sensor officers flagged it as anomalous. They ran it through the recognition database. Nothing came back. Kos ordered the fleet to slow and recalibrate sensors. It was a cautious move, the right move for an unknown contact. What he did not know was that slowing the fleet was exactly what Tanaka needed him to do. Part 1 had begun. The Keth 11th Grand Fleet had a problem it did not yet know it had. It was a problem of geometry. When you build a fleet of 11,000 warships, you cannot put all 11,000 of them in the same place at the same time. Ships need space to maneuver. Weapons need clear firing lanes. Formation flying at that scale is a precise and demanding art, and the Keth had mastered it over centuries. Their fleet moved through space in a series of interlocking layers. A forward screen of lighter vessels, flanked by mid-weight cruisers, with the heavy capital ships at the core, and supply vessels and support craft trailing behind the main formation in their own carefully managed column. It was an effective formation, It had won battles. It was also, as Tanaka had noted during her 8 years of planning, extremely sensitive to interference at the edges. The Keth fleet crossed into the outer system and began the long transit toward humanity's inner worlds. They were not rushing. There was no need. Their scanners showed no significant military presence between them and the target colonies. The human navy's known positions were well inside the transit corridor, arranged in a defensive posture that the Keth tactical team had already modeled and dismissed. They would reach the first major human installation, a colony on a planet called Variant 4, within 41 hours. Koss spent that time reviewing the post-war administration plans. He was a thorough man. He liked having the details settled before the fighting was done. He did not spend much time thinking about Gravenmoor. Gravenmoor was behind them. They had passed within sensor range of its outer edge without detecting any significant human presence inside. Their probes had returned data consistent with an empty nebula, interference, gas density readings, the normal electromagnetic noise of a young cloud still undergoing formation. There were some anomalous readings, but anomalous readings were normal inside a nebula. Their analysts had logged them and moved on. What the analysts had not recognized, because no one in the Keth intelligence apparatus had thought to look for this specific signature, was that the anomalous readings were not random. They were structured, very faintly, very carefully, but structured. The kind of structure that only exists when someone has deliberately arranged something to look like random noise. Commander Yusuf Adesanya was watching the fleet's movement on a display that looked, at first glance, like a weather map. Hundreds of small indicators tracked positions, speeds, and headings across a volume of space roughly 8 light hours across. It was a complex picture, and Adesanya had a gift for reading complexity. He had been a nav officer before moving into operations, and he had the particular skill of people who have spent years watching many things move at once, the ability to see patterns in what appeared to be chaos. He watched the Keth formation move, and he watched the edges. "They're tightening the rear column," he said to the officer beside him. "Supply ships are pulling closer to the main body." "Defensive response to the anomalous contacts?" the officer asked. "Probably. Which means they're nervous. Which means the Phase 1 signals did their job." He paused, checking a secondary display. "But they haven't slowed down enough. Tanaka will want them slower." Adesanya picked up his comm. "Admiral, fleet still moving faster than the model predicted. Recommend we light up the secondary emitters." Tanaka's voice came back immediately. She had not slept in 22 hours, but she sounded exactly as she had when this had all started. Calm, precise. "Agreed. Tell Navarro to sequence them on a 4-minute delay, and keep them inside the nebula boundary. I don't want them realizing the sources are moving." "Understood." Deep inside the Gravenmoor Nebula, the secondary emitters came online. They were small devices, physically smaller than a human being, and they had been placed inside the nebula by automated courier drones over the course of 3 years. Each one was powered by a small cold fusion cell and shielded against the nebula's electromagnetic environment. Each one broadcast a carefully designed signal, not a weapon signature, not a communication signal, but something that fell into the gray zone between natural phenomena and artificial activity. Something that a Keth sensor officer would look at and not be certain about. Uncertainty was the point. The Keth tactical team aboard the Eternal Dominion began receiving the new signals 40 minutes after they went active. There were 7 new contact sources, all inside the nebula, all at different depths. The team worked quickly and professionally. They ran the signals through every recognition algorithm they had. They compared the patterns against the database. They analyzed the power outputs and the frequency distributions. They came up with 3 possibilities. 1. The signals were natural phenomena, caused by the nebula's internal dynamics. 2. The signals were human sensor equipment, unmanned relays or monitoring stations. 3. The signals were human warships hiding inside the nebula. The tactical team's senior analyst, a sharp-minded officer named Vreth Kalas, laid out all 3 possibilities for Commander Koss. She recommended treating option 3 as the most likely, reducing fleet speed while they resolved the uncertainty, and sending in a probe squadron to investigate. Koss listened carefully. He was not a stupid man. He asked good questions. He understood the risk. Then he made his decision. "We probe," he said, "but we don't slow the main fleet. If they have ships in the nebula, they're in the nebula. They can't strike us from in there without coming out first. And if they come out, we see them coming. Keep moving. Send in 2 probe squadrons. Light ships only. Expendable. I want readings from inside the nebula within 6 hours. It was a reasonable decision. It was the decision that a competent, experienced commander would make with the information available. It was also wrong. The probe squadrons, 42 light scout ships, entered the Gravenmoor Nebula at its nearest edge, and immediately began experiencing the effects that any ship entering a dense nebula experiences. Sensor range dropped to a few hundred kilometers. Communication with the fleet degraded. Navigation became a matter of dead reckoning and constant minor corrections. The pilots were good. They kept their formations tight and moved carefully deeper into the cloud. They did not find warships. What they found, or rather, what found them, was the third layer of Tanaka's preparation. The Gravenmoor Nebula had been seeded, not just with emitters, not just with sensors. Over 8 years, using automated systems and small crewed missions that had been officially described as scientific surveys, the human Navy had placed a network of systems inside the nebula that, individually, were unremarkable, but together, organized and activated by a central coordinating signal, they became something else entirely. The probe squadron's readings began coming back to the fleet erratically. Partial data, corrupted signals, delayed transmissions. Normal for a nebula mostly. COS's analysts processed what came through and saw no sign of human warships. They saw the emitter signals. They saw the interference. They did not see anything that looked like a trap. Which was the point. Back on Titan Station, Tanaka was watching the probe squadron's movements on her display. She had a direct feed from the sensor network inside Gravenmoor, which gave her significantly better situational awareness inside the nebula than the Keth had from outside. She watched the 42 probe ships moving through the cloud. She watched their headings. She watched the gaps in their formation, where the sensor interference was affecting their cohesion. She turned to Adesanya. "Call Vega Squadron." He nodded and began transmitting. Vega Squadron was not a large force. It consisted of 22 human warships, a mix of destroyer-class and frigate-class vessels, fast and relatively lightly armored. They had been sitting inside the Gravenmoor Nebula for 11 days. The crews had been living on short rations and recycled air, and the specific kind of boredom that comes from waiting in a dark, cramped space for something to happen. They were, to put it plainly, ready. They did not engage the probe squadrons directly. They herded them. It was a subtle operation that required a great deal of skill and restraint. Vega Squadron's ships did not fire a single weapon. Instead, they used their drives, short, carefully timed burns, to create gravitational and electromagnetic signatures that the Keth probe ship's degraded sensors would read as obstacles or hazards. A human pilot, comfortable with close nebula flying, would have recognized the signatures for what they were. A Keth probe pilot, working with sensors that were giving him 60% degraded readouts, operating in an environment his training had not fully prepared him for, followed the path of least resistance. The path of least resistance led the probe squadrons deeper into the nebula, and deeper meant further from the fleet. It took 4 hours. The probe squadrons were professional and careful, and they did not move fast in the degraded conditions, but they moved. And by the end of the 4th hour they were more than 3,000 kilometers inside the nebula's edge. Their communications with the main fleet reduced to intermittent bursts, their sensor data largely unreliable, their position relative to each other approximate rather than precise. That was when Vega Squadron stopped herding and started hunting. The first 3 Keth probe ships were destroyed so quickly that the rest of the squadron did not immediately understand what was happening. The weapons fire came from multiple directions simultaneously, timed to arrive within fractions of a second of each other, using the nebula's natural interference to mask the origin points. It was a technique that human weapons engineers had developed specifically for the conditions inside a dense nebula. It required precise timing and extraordinary coordination between ships that could not directly communicate in real time. It had been practiced 800 times in simulation. The Keth probe pilots responded well, under the circumstances. They broke formation and scattered, trying to get enough separation to improve their sensor readings and find the attackers. It was the correct tactical response in open space. Inside a dense nebula, It was the worst thing they could do. Scattered, isolated, each working with degraded sensors in a strange environment, the probe ships became easy targets. Vega Squadron was methodical. They did not rush. They moved from contact to contact, using the nebula itself as cover, striking and repositioning before the Keth could locate them. 17 of the 42 probe ships were destroyed in the first 2 hours of engagement. The survivors transmitted what data they had to the main fleet and began trying to navigate out of the nebula. 4 of them made it. Koss received the reports. He read them carefully. He looked at the numbers. 17 probe ships lost, 4 returned with data, the rest silent. He looked at the engagement data the survivors had transmitted, which was fragmented and incomplete. He looked at what his analysts were able to piece together from it. He did not laugh this time. "They have ships inside the nebula," he said. "How many?" His chief tactical officer reviewed the data. "Unknown. The probe data is insufficient to determine fleet size. Estimates range from a handful of small vessels to potentially significant forces." "Significant how?" The officer hesitated. "Significant enough to have destroyed 38 of our probe ships without a single confirmed loss on their side, sir. Though I want to be clear that our data is very incomplete." Koss was quiet for a moment. He was rethinking, not panicking. He had 11,000 ships. Nothing inside a nebula could threaten 11,000 ships. But he was rethinking his assumptions, which was the right thing to do. "Halt the fleet," he said. "Full stop. I want a complete sensor sweep of the nebula's outer edge, and I want Vreth Kalas in this room within the hour." The fleet stopped. On Titan Station, Adesanya saw the Keth formation slow on his display, then stop. He allowed himself a small sound that was not quite a smile. "They stopped," he said. "Good," Tanaka said. She was looking at a different display, a broader view that showed not just the Keth fleet, but the entire region of space around it, around the nebula, around the transit corridor. She was looking at the shape of the situation, the way a chess player looks at a board. "Now," she said quietly, "we make them look left." She picked up her comm and called a man named Admiral Chen Wei, who was waiting 300 light seconds away, with 60 warships, and a set of orders that had seemed, when Tanaka had given them, completely insane. Chen Wei had not said they were insane. He had said, "How long do I have before they figure out what I'm actually doing?" Tanaka had said, 17 minutes, if we're lucky, 12 if we're not. Chen Wei had absorbed this. Then he had said, "And you need me to make it convincing." "I need you," Tanaka had said, "to make it the most terrifying thing they've ever seen, just for 12 minutes. Chen Wei had looked at the orders for a long time. Then he had nodded slowly. "I can do 12 minutes, he said. "God help me. I think I can do 12 minutes. He had been waiting ever since. He stopped waiting when Tanaka's signal reached him. 60 human warships dropped out of jump space on the far side of the Keth fleet, the side facing away from Gravenmoor, and immediately began broadcasting on every frequency available. Not weapons fire, not targeting signals, broadcasts. Loud, messy, deliberately wasteful broadcasts that made 60 ships read on sensors like something considerably larger. The Keth fleet turned to face the new contact. And while they were turning, while 11,000 ships were adjusting their formation to address the threat appearing behind them, they stopped watching Gravenmoor. Inside the nebula, something began to move. Not 22 ships, not 60. Not the number that Koss's analysts had estimated based on incomplete probe data. The Gravenmoor preparation, which was what Tanaka called it in her private notes, though it had several much more dramatic names in the operational planning documents, had taken 8 years. During those 8 years, a total of 312 human warships had been brought into the nebula in small groups, over long periods, through routes that avoided Keth sensor coverage. They had been maintained by rotating crews delivered by stealth couriers. Their power signatures had been suppressed to the minimum levels needed to sustain life support. They had been waiting. 312 warships began moving toward the edge of the nebula. Koss's fleet was still turning when the first of them emerged. The battle had no clean beginning. That was the first thing that surprised the Keth. In every engagement they had fought across 117 conquered worlds, battles had a shape. There was a moment of contact, a moment where the lines met, and then a period of ordered chaos, that, properly managed, resolved in favor of the larger and better-equipped force. There was a before and an after. The Keth were very good at managing the chaos in between. What happened at Gravenmoor did not have that shape. When 312 human warships emerged from the nebula, they did not emerge in a formation. Formations required coordination over open comms, and open comms in the vicinity of Gravenmoor were unreliable. They had known this going in. Tanaka had planned for it. Each ship captain had a target list, an objective, and a set of contingency protocols that had been memorized and drilled until they could be executed without any communication with Fleet Command at all. The human ships emerged in groups, 3s, 5s, sometimes singles, spread across a 60,000-kilometer front. They came out of the nebula in different directions, at different speeds, some hot and aggressive, and some slow and careful, each moving toward a specific part of the Keth formation. None of them went for the flagship. None of them went for the heaviest warships. They went for something else. They went for the edges. A fleet of 11,000 ships, seen from outside, looks like a wall. It looks impenetrable. But a fleet is not just warships. A fleet is warships and supply vessels and fuel tankers and repair ships, and communications relays, and medical ships, and 100 other supporting craft that keep the warships fighting. And these supporting craft are not, generally, at the center of the formation. They are at the edges, and at the rear, where they can do their work without being in the line of fire. Tanaka had looked at the Keth fleet's known formation doctrine, collected over years from intelligence sources and publicly available military analysis, and she had identified a specific vulnerability, not in the warships themselves, in the web of support that kept the warships functioning. 312 human ships hit the edges of the Keth formation simultaneously, from multiple directions, and they did not try to fight the warships. They hit the support vessels, the fuel tankers, the ammunition convoys, the long-range communication relay ships that allowed COS to coordinate 11,000 vessels as a single unified force. In the first 8 minutes of the battle, the Keth lost 41 support vessels and 3 communication relay ships. It sounds like a small number against 11,000. It was not a small number. The loss of the relay ships was what mattered most. The Keth had a fleet communication system that was, in normal conditions, highly effective. It allowed COS to issue orders that reached every ship in his fleet within seconds. It was the system that made coordinating 11,000 ships possible. It depended on the relay ships to extend its range and maintain signal clarity. With 3 relay ships gone, the signal degraded. Not catastrophically, not at first, but in a battle that was already creating noise and interference across every sensor band, degraded communication meant slower orders. Slower orders meant slower responses, and slower responses, against an enemy that was specifically targeting the support layer and moving fast, meant growing chaos. COS saw it happening. He was a good commander and he understood immediately what Tanaka was doing. He issued orders to his warship picket lines to pull back and screen the support vessels. It was the right call. His picket commanders received the order, most of them, and began moving to comply. By the time they completed the repositioning, the human ships had already hit 6 more support vessels and then scattered back toward the nebula's edge. Not retreating. Repositioning. This was the pattern that the battle followed for the first 3 hours. The human forces would emerge, strike a specific target set, absorb the return fire from the responding Keth warships, and then use their speed and familiarity with the nebula's edge to break off and disappear back into the cloud before the Keth could bring their heavier forces to bear. In open space, with full sensor coverage and reliable communications, the Keth warships would have hunted the human ships down easily. In the conditions at Gravenmoor's edge, they could not maintain contact long enough. The Keth lost 11 warships in those 3 hours. The human forces lost 9. On a pure numbers basis, the Keth could sustain those losses indefinitely. 11 ships from 11,000 was nothing. What was not nothing was the accumulating damage to the support layer, the degrading communication quality, and the psychological effect on a fleet that had been told this would be a quick, clean operation against an outmatched opponent. COS called a command conference. He gathered his senior admirals via the still-functioning, if noisy, communication net, and laid out the situation. "They're using the nebula as a base," he said. They come out, strike, and go back in. We cannot effectively follow them into the nebula. We proved that with the probe squadrons. What we can do is put enough ships at the nebula's edge to prevent them from coming out effectively, while the main fleet continues toward the human worlds. Admiral Voth Wren, who commanded the fleet's 2nd Division, disagreed. If we split the fleet, we reduce the force available for the advance, and the force guarding the nebula. We may create a situation where neither force is strong enough for its task. Koss acknowledged the concern. How many ships would you need to seal the nebula exit points? Vreth Kalas, who was in the room, had been running numbers since the battle started. The nebula has exits across a 60,000-kilometer front. To effectively screen all of them, accounting for the engagement distances and response times we've seen, I estimate 1,500 ships minimum, 2,000 to be confident. 2,000 ships to watch a nebula, 9,000 to continue the advance. Koss made his decision. It was, again, a reasonable decision. It was the decision a competent commander makes when faced with an enemy using terrain as a force multiplier. You seal the terrain. You stop them from using it. He pulled 2,000 ships from the main fleet and arrayed them in a semicircle around the active edge of Gravenmoor. He ordered them into a layered screen, light fast ships at the front, heavy ships behind, with overlapping fields of fire that covered the nebula's exit zones. He then turned the remaining 9,000 ships back toward the transit corridor and resumed the advance. Tanaka, watching this on her display, allowed herself a small smile. He split, she said. He had to, Adesanya said. We left him no good option. There are no good options for an 11,000-ship fleet that doesn't know which way the threat is coming from. She looked at her display for a moment longer. Call Admiral Santos. Admiral Lucia Santos commanded a force that had not yet been used. She had been waiting, like Chen Wei, like Vega Squadron, in a position that required patience and exact timing. Her force was different from the others. It was not hidden in the nebula. It was not making noise to draw attention. It was sitting, very quietly, in a region of space that the Keth fleet had already passed through on its way in. Behind the fleet, between the fleet and its jump points, Santos received Tanaka's signal and acknowledged it with a single word: moving. Her force consisted of 140 ships, a mixed group that included some of the most powerful vessels in the human navy. They were not fast ships. They were not designed for the kind of hit-and-run work that Vega Squadron did. They were heavy warships, the kind that absorb punishment and give it back, the kind that do not need speed because they do not run. They began moving toward the rear of the Keth fleet. The Keth rear guard, the ships responsible for protecting the fleet's back as it advanced, spotted Santos's force about 20 minutes before it arrived. They transmitted warning to Koss. The message took longer than it should have to reach him, because 3 more relay ships had been destroyed by a Vega Squadron strike, while Koss was making his decision about splitting the fleet. When the message reached him, Koss read it and immediately understood the situation. He was caught between 2 forces, a harassment force at the nebula and a heavy force at his rear. Neither force was large enough to threaten 11,000 ships, but he could not ignore either, and he could not advance with full confidence while enemies were active behind him. He pulled the fleet to a full stop again. He reoriented 500 ships to face Santos's approaching force. The engagement with Santos's force was the first full conventional fleet battle of the war. 140 human heavy warships against 500 Keth warships, fought in open space with no terrain advantage for either side. The Keth won it. They won it in the way a fist wins against a smaller fist, by being larger. Santos lost 31 ships. The Keth lost 87. But Santos had not been sent to win. She had been sent to cost them something, and to keep them stopped. She had kept them stopped for 4 hours and 17 minutes. During those 4 hours and 17 minutes, a Vega Squadron captain named Hira Okeki had taken her ship deep into the Gravenmoor Nebula, further than any human ship had gone in the operational period. She was not looking for a fight. She was looking for the relay point, a specific location inside the nebula where the human sensor network concentrated its data before transmitting it to Titan Station. She found it. She collected a data package that had been accumulating for 6 hours. and she transmitted it. Tanaka received the data. She spent 40 minutes going through it with Adesanya and 3 of her senior analysts. When she was done, she had a picture of the Keth fleet's current state that was more detailed than anything her intelligence services had assembled before the war started. The fleet was stressed, not broken, not close to broken, but the accumulating impacts were showing. Communication had degraded another 8%. Fuel consumption was above normal due to the repeated stops and repositioning. 1,200 support vessels had been struck, damaged, or destroyed. The supply chain that sustained 11,000 ships' worth of weapons, fuel, and materiel was developing gaps. More importantly, the fleet had stopped twice. It had been fighting at the edge of a nebula it had not planned to fight at. It had detached 2,000 ships to screen the nebula exit and sent 500 more to deal with Santos. It had been surprised 3 times in 12 hours. 11,000 ships, but 11,000 ships that were no longer moving confidently toward a target. Koss held another command conference. This time, his admirals were not calm. Admiral Vyeth-Ren said flatly that the fleet needed to reassess its approach. Admiral Ten Kavash said they should destroy the nebula, ignite it with specialized ordnance, and remove the human ship's shelter. A third admiral, one who had been quiet throughout, said something that silenced the room. What if they have more ships we haven't seen yet? Koss looked at the question for a long moment. Then he said, "Show me the intelligence estimate of their total fleet strength." The estimate said, fewer than 800 vessels, total. He had 312 confirmed from the nebula, 140 from Santos's force, 22 from Vega Squadron, 22 from the second Vega force that had hit the rear screen. That was already 496 vessels, not 800. 496 accounted for. Koss set the estimate down. "The intelligence is wrong," he said quietly. The room went very still. "How wrong?" Kavash asked. Koss looked at the display, at the operational map, at the positions and the losses and the 4 hours of progress they had not made because they had been dealing with threats that the intelligence said should not exist at this scale. "I don't know," he said, "and that is the problem." On Titan Station, Tanaka did not know that Koss had said this. But she had spent 8 years predicting how a Keth commander would think in exactly this situation, and she had written down, in a private planning document that very few people had ever seen, what she believed the tipping point would be. The tipping point was not destruction. A fleet of 11,000 ships cannot be destroyed by what humanity had available. The tipping point was uncertainty, the moment when a commander who had gone to war with total confidence in his intelligence picture realized that the picture was wrong. That was the moment when a fleet of 11,000 ships stopped being an unstoppable force and started being 11,000 ships with a problem they could not calculate. She had planned for that moment. She had one more card to play. She picked up her comm and called a name that had not yet appeared in any of the operational orders, a name she had kept out of the planning documents and off the official briefings, and away from the battle entirely until now. "Dr. Amara," she said. "It's time." Dr. Priya Amara was not a soldier. She was 53 years old, small, with ink-stained fingers and a habit of talking very fast when she was excited, which was most of the time. She had spent 30 years as a theoretical physicist at the University of Bangalore, before the government had quietly knocked on her door 12 years ago, and offered her a problem that was, she was told, completely hypothetical. The hypothetical problem was this: if a species with highly advanced jump drive technology were to deploy a large fleet in a confined region of space and make numerous short-range jumps over an extended period, what would happen to the local fabric of jump space in that region? She had worked on the hypothetical problem for 2 years before she realized it was not hypothetical at all. By then, she was deep enough into the work that she kept going, because the answer was turning out to be fascinating. The answer was, it depended. Jump drives worked by briefly punching a ship through a higher dimensional layer that allowed it to travel vast distances in a short time. The mechanics were well understood, in the way that the mechanics of radio waves were well understood. You knew how to use it and you could predict its behavior. But the underlying physics was complex enough that most people working with it treated it as a reliable tool, rather than a thing to be examined. The Keth had been using jump drives for centuries. They had never had a problem with them. Amara's research suggested a reason why. In all that time, the Keth had never concentrated so many jump-capable ships in such a small region of space, and made them all jump repeatedly over such a short period. When ships jump, they leave traces. Not physical traces, nothing you can see or touch, but in the higher dimensional layer that jump drives exploit. Repeated jumps in the same region create what Amara called resonance patterns. Individual ships, jumping occasionally, produced resonance that dissipated quickly and harmlessly. But hundreds or thousands of ships, jumping repeatedly in a confined space over hours or days, could build resonance that did not dissipate. It accumulated. At a certain threshold, which Amara had calculated with considerable effort and a margin of error she considered uncomfortably large, accumulated resonance in a region of space would begin to affect jump drive calibration. Not catastrophically, not instantly, but progressively, like a frequency that builds until it starts to distort the medium it travels through. What this meant in practical terms was that a fleet which had been making many short-range jumps in a confined area, say, repositioning repeatedly during an extended engagement near a particular nebula, might find, after some hours, that their jump drives were no longer calculating quite correctly. The jumps would still work, but the destinations would be slightly off. A ship trying to jump 2 light-years might arrive 2.1 light-years away, or 1.9, or, if the resonance was bad enough, somewhere in between, with a vector that did not match the intended heading. In open space, a few tenths of a light-year of error in a 2 light-year jump was manageable. Annoying, but manageable. In a confined region of space, surrounded by a nebula and other ships and debris from an ongoing battle, a jump drive that was calculating slightly wrong was something else entirely. Tanaka had read Amara's research 8 years ago. She had immediately classified it at the highest level available, brought Amara into the project, and begun designing the battle around it. The key insight was not that the resonance effect would destroy the Keth fleet. Amara had been very clear that it would not do that. What it would do was make the fleet's jump drives unreliable, and a fleet that cannot jump, or cannot jump accurately, cannot retreat, cannot reinforce, cannot maneuver in the way that modern fleet combat requires. It could still fight, it could still shoot, but it would be fighting on foot, in a sense, while the human force remained fully mobile. The second key insight was that the effect was cumulative. The more the Keth fleet jumped, the worse it would get. And Tanaka's plan had been specifically designed to make the Keth fleet jump as much as possible. Every time they repositioned, every time they shifted formation to respond to a new threat, every short-range jump they made to close distance or escape fire, each one added to the resonance. They had been jumping for 14 hours. Amara was on a small research vessel positioned at what she had calculated was the optimal observation distance from the Keth fleet, close enough to get useful sensor data, far enough that her ship was in no immediate danger. She was reading data as it came in, running it through models on her personal system, and comparing the results to her predictions. When Tanaka called, Amara looked at her current readings and felt something very particular. The specific thrill of a scientist who has predicted something strange and is watching it actually happen. The resonance is at 61% of threshold, she told Tanaka. Based on their current jump frequency, they'll hit threshold in approximately 4 to 6 hours. What happens at threshold? Jump error increases sharply. Below threshold it's small, maybe 5% variance. At threshold and above, I've modeled it as potentially 40 to 60% variance, meaning a ship trying to jump 1 light-year could end up anywhere from half a light-year to 1.6 light-years from the intended destination. In the middle of a fleet formation, Amara paused. That would be very bad for them. Ships arriving in unexpected positions at jump velocities, inside a dense formation. Yes, very bad. How do we accelerate it? Make them jump more. Short-range jumps contribute more resonance per unit distance than long-range ones, if you can make them jump frequently over short distances. I can do that, Tanaka said. Stand by. She turned to Adesanya. Tell all units. Phase 4. Maximum harassment. I want every ship we have making the Keth jump as much as possible. Hit them from angles that require repositioning. Drive them into short-range maneuvers. We do not need to destroy them. We need to make them move. Adesanya started passing orders. What followed was the most intense 4 hours of the battle. The human forces, Vega Squadron, the remaining ships of Santos's heavy group, a third force that had been held in reserve and had not yet been committed, and the ships that had been rotating out of the nebula throughout the engagement, all hit the Keth formation simultaneously, from 6 different directions. They did not fight to win, they fought to annoy. It is a strange thing to build an entire military operation around annoyance. It required Tanaka's captains to do things that every military instinct screamed was wrong. To charge in, take fire, and then jump away instead of pressing the advantage. To be effective, and then immediately retreat. To make themselves a constant, persistent irritation, without ever committing to a decisive engagement. The Keth responded exactly as Tanaka had modeled. They jumped. Short hops to close distance with attackers who immediately jumped away. Formation adjustments that required dozens of ships to make simultaneous micro-jumps. Defensive repositioning as each new wave came in from a new angle. Jump, jump, jump. The resonance climbed. At the 2-hour mark, Koss began noticing something wrong with his fleet's positioning data. Ships were arriving at their jump destinations slightly off. Not dangerously, his navigators corrected quickly. But the corrections were getting larger. He flagged it to his engineering staff, who ran diagnostics on the jump drives of several nearby ships. The drives tested clean. The engineering staff attributed the positioning variance to interference from the ongoing battle. Weapons fire, debris, the electromagnetic noise of hundreds of ships engaging simultaneously. It was a reasonable conclusion. It was wrong. At the 3-hour mark, the first serious incident occurred. A cruiser in the fleet's 3rd Division made a short-range jump to pursue a human frigate and arrived inside the formation rather than outside it. The jump was off by 11 degrees and half a light second. The cruiser emerged from jump space directly in the path of 2 other Keth warships. Emergency drives on all 3 ships prevented a collision, but the near miss was logged and flagged. 15 minutes later, a second incident. A destroyer jumped to reinforce a picket line and arrived 400 kilometers short of its intended position, which put it inside a spread of debris from earlier ship losses. The destroyer took damage, not fatal damage, but damage. Koss received both reports and called his chief engineer. "What is happening to our jump drives?" The engineer ran more diagnostics. Everything tested clean. He ran them again. Clean. He looked at the positioning data, the pattern of how the errors were growing, and felt a slow, cold understanding forming. "Admiral," he said carefully, "I think we may have a spatial resonance problem." Koss did not know what that meant. His chief engineer explained it to him as quickly and clearly as he could. When the explanation was finished, Koss was very quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How do we fix it?" "We stop jumping," the engineer said. "If we stop making jumps in this region, the resonance will dissipate. It will take, I estimate, 6 to 8 hours for it to drop to safe levels. And if we keep jumping, the error increases. I cannot tell you exactly how bad it gets. I've never encountered this in a fleet operation before. But based on the rate of increase, within 2 to 3 hours, any jump we make in this region becomes unpredictable." Unpredictable. 11,000 ships, and the word unpredictable. Koss stood at his command display and looked at the battle map. His fleet had been stopped, repositioned, split, hit from multiple directions, and was now facing a problem with its fundamental mobility that none of his systems had detected or predicted. He looked at the human force dispositions, still active, still hitting him from multiple points, still making him move. He understood, in that moment, what had been done to him. Not just the battle, the whole shape of it, the years of preparation that had gone into the nebula, the careful pace of the engagement, always hitting hard enough to force a response, but never hard enough to justify a decisive commitment, the accumulation of small damages to his support layer, the relay ship losses that had degraded his communications, and underneath all of it, something he had never seen in a military intelligence report, something that was not in any of his databases, a weapon that was not a weapon at all, a phenomenon, a trap built from physics. He had been herded, exactly like his probe squadrons had been herded deeper into the nebula. Herded into jumping and jumping and jumping again, until jumping itself became dangerous. All units, he said, his voice was very controlled. Cease jump operations immediately. Thrusters only. Formation hold at current positions. The orders went out. The Keth fleet stopped jumping. On Titan Station, Tanaka received Amara's update. Jump frequency from the Keth formation had dropped to near zero. She checked the time. She checked the resonance readings. She pulled up the fleet status board. She had hurt them. She had stopped them. She had made their jump drives unreliable and then made them stop using them. But stopping was not winning. A fleet of 11,000 ships that was not jumping was still 11,000 ships. They could still fire. They could still advance, slowly, on thrusters. They still had enough firepower to destroy every human installation between here and Earth. This was the moment she had planned for all along. Not the nebula, not the resonance, not Santos's attack or Chen Wei's distraction, or Vega Squadron's harassment. All of those were preparation. This moment, the moment when the Keth fleet was stopped, stressed, uncertain, and no longer able to use its full mobility, was when the actual plan began. She reached for her comm. She called not an admiral, not a ship captain, not a weapons officer. She called Ambassador Rena Voss. Voss, who was still on the council station, who had been watching the battle reports coming in for the past 18 hours, who had not slept and had not eaten, and had been sitting at her desk with her hands folded in front of her, waiting. "Ambassador," Tanaka said, "it's time to make your call." Voss unclenched her hands. She stood up. She straightened her jacket. "Give me a direct channel to the Eternal Dominion," she said to her communications officer. The channel opened. She spoke the words she had prepared, not to threaten, not to demand. She spoke them the way you speak to someone who is standing at the edge of a very high place and has just realized it. Carefully, clearly, and with the very specific kind of calm that comes from knowing something the other person does not yet, but is about to learn. Veltar Kos received the ambassador's transmission and did not respond immediately. He stood at his command display aboard the Eternal Dominion and let the words settle. Voss had spoken for 3 minutes and 40 seconds. She had not threatened. She had not demanded. She had done something more dangerous. She had explained. She had explained what had been done to his fleet, and why, and what would happen next if he chose to continue. The spatial resonance, she told him, was not permanent. If his fleet stopped making short-range jumps and held position for 6 to 8 hours, it would dissipate. His jump drives would return to full function. He could then leave this region of space without further incident. He could take his 11,000 ships, minus the losses he had already suffered, and go home. If he chose to advance instead, using thrusters, the human forces would continue to engage his support layer and his communications network. They would not be able to destroy his fleet. They did not need to. They needed only to keep him here, keep him jumping in small bursts to respond to threats, keep the resonance building, until his jump drives became genuinely unreliable. At that point, a fleet of 11,000 ships attempting to make a coordinated jump through a contested region would face the real possibility of ships arriving in each other's jump paths. "We are not asking you to surrender," Voss said. "We are not asking you to recognize defeat. We are asking you to consider the cost of the next step carefully, because we have, and we know what it is. We suspect you do not." She paused. Her voice stayed level. "Fleet Admiral Tanaka prepared for this engagement for 8 years, not because she knew you were coming, because she knew someone was coming, eventually, and she wanted to be ready. We did not start this war. We did not want it. But we have been fighting it, in our way, since the day your fleet left Tessevar. What you have experienced in the last 18 hours is not the limit of what has been prepared. It is the beginning." Another pause. Shorter this time. "We will give you 6 hours to decide." The channel closed. Kos stood very still. Then he turned to Vreth Kalas, who had been listening to the transmission from a station 3 steps behind him. "Tell me she is bluffing," he said. Kalas was quiet for a long moment. She was a careful person. She did not say things she was not sure of. "I cannot tell you that, Admiral," she said. He nodded. He had expected that answer. He walked to his command chair and sat down and looked at his battle display. It showed him everything: the fleet positions, the human force dispositions, the damage reports, the degraded relay network, the engineering alerts about jump variants that were now appearing on 4 different ship systems besides his own. He looked at the numbers he had when this started. 11,214 ships, the most powerful fleet the Keth Dominion had assembled in 60 years. He looked at the numbers he had now. Roughly 10,800 operational, the rest damaged, destroyed, or pulled back with critical system faults. Still enormous, still overwhelming by any standard measure. Still 11,000 ships, more or less, against a force that had never numbered more than 600 by the most generous accounting he could construct from his battle data. And yet he was stopped. His drives were unreliable. His communication network was degraded by 43%. His supply chain had gaps that would affect combat sustainability within 20 hours. His probe squadrons were gone. His rear had been struck twice. His fleet had been made to stop and turn and reposition so many times in the past 18 hours that his crew rotation schedules had broken down and his senior bridge officers had been awake for nearly a full day. He thought about what Voss had said. 8 years of preparation. He thought about the probe squadrons herded deeper into the nebula. He thought about the emitters and the way they had been sequenced to look like something other than what they were. He thought about Chen Wei's 60 ships, appearing behind the fleet and making so much noise that everyone had looked at them instead of at the nebula. He thought about Santos's heavy force, positioned behind the fleet before the battle started, waiting. He thought about the spatial resonance, a phenomenon that was not in any of his scientific or tactical databases, that had apparently been discovered by a human scientist and then kept quiet, specifically so that it could be used here. He thought about the word in the intelligence reports, adequate for policing minor disputes. He thought about Velthar Koss standing on the command deck and laughing. He called his senior admirals. He told them what he was considering. He expected argument. He expected at least one of them to tell him that 11,000 ships did not retreat from 800, that the Dominion's reputation could not withstand it, that they should advance on thrusters and let the battle resolve the way battles were supposed to resolve, by the side with more ships winning. Admiral Voth Wren said none of that. He said, if she is right about what happens when the resonance peaks, if ships start arriving in each other's jump paths, we could lose hundreds of vessels in the jump alone before we fire a single weapon. Yes, Koss said. And we still don't know how many ships they have that we haven't seen yet. No. Wren was quiet. Then, she said 8 years of preparation. We planned this campaign for 6 months. Yes. Another silence. Then Wren said something that Koss had been thinking but had not said aloud. We didn't lose this battle. We were never in it. We were in the battle they prepared for us. Koss closed the conference line. He sat alone with his display for a few minutes. Then he opened a channel to Voss. She answered immediately. She looked, he thought, exhausted but very awake. We will withdraw, Koss said, on the condition that there is no pursuit. Voss said, there will be no pursuit. He believed her. He was not entirely sure why. Perhaps because she had been the one explaining things to him, not threatening him, and explanations usually came from people who did not need to threaten. I will need more than 6 hours for the resonance to clear, he said. My engineers estimate 8 to 10. We understand, Voss said. We will maintain current positions. You will not be engaged during the withdrawal. The channel closed. Koss issued the withdrawal orders. The fleet began its long, slow repositioning. On thrusters, carefully, with constant attention to spacing and navigation, to avoid the risks that came with unreliable drives. It took 9 hours and 40 minutes before his engineers confirmed the resonance had dropped to safe levels. In that time, no human ship fired on the Keth fleet. They simply watched. The Keth fleet jumped out of the system in coordinated waves, the same way they had arrived. It took 4 hours for all 11,000 ships to clear the region. When the last Keth vessel vanished from the display on Titan Station, the command room was very quiet for a moment. Then someone started clapping, then someone else, and then it was everyone, all at once, and the sound was not quite enough for what it was, not the sound of a victory exactly, but the sound of something held too tight for too long finally being let go. Tanaka did not clap. She stood at her display and watched the empty space where the fleet had been. She looked at the battle data, the final tallies, the loss counts, the damage reports, the fuel and ammunition expenditure figures that would take days to fully account for. 49 human ships destroyed, more than 300 damaged, 11,000 Keth ships withdrawn. She thought about what it had cost to build what had been used here. 8 years. The hidden shipyards in the outer belt. The long supply runs into Gravenmoor. The research funding for Amara's work. The quiet work of Admiral Chen Wei and Admiral Santos, and Captain Okeke and Vega Squadron, and all the others who had trained for this specific battle against this specific threat for years before anyone had officially acknowledged the threat existed. She thought about all the people who had called her paranoid. She picked up her comm and called a number she had not called in 8 years. When the line connected, she said, "Senator Harlow, it's Tanaka. I believe you owe me a budget conversation." She said it without heat, just as a fact. The senator said something that Tanaka would later describe only as appropriately humble. The news reached Earth 6 hours after the Keth fleet withdrew. The reaction was immediate and enormous, streets full of people, broadcasts running everywhere, a noise that was part disbelief, and part relief, and part something older and louder, that human beings had always made when they had been told they could not do something, and then done it anyway. Ambassador Voss was still on the council station when it happened. She watched it on a small screen in her office, the footage from Earth, from the colony worlds, the faces of people who had spent weeks watching the most powerful fleet assembled against them in human history, approaching their homes. She watched them and she felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, something that was not quite hope and not quite certainty, but something in between. She had a meeting with the Galactic Mediation Council in 4 hours. It would be a different kind of meeting than the ones she had attended before. She was not sure exactly how different. The Keth still had their seats and their allies and their centuries of influence, but they had come with 11,000 ships to make an example of humanity, and they were going home with something different, not a defeat. They would not call it that, and in the strict sense it was not. They had lost ships, but not catastrophically. They had withdrawn, not surrendered. What they had lost was the thing that matters more than ships. They had lost the certainty. That quiet, deep, total confidence that they knew what humanity was, and what it could do, and what would happen when they brought force to bear against it. That certainty had been built over years, and it had been a lie, and now everyone in the galaxy who had been watching, and many had been watching, knew it was a lie. In the council chamber, in the weeks that followed, the silence after human statements was shorter. Veltar Kos was not present. He had been reassigned to a posting in the Outer Dominion, which everyone understood was not a compliment. His replacement was a younger diplomat named Teth Varan, who had the particular careful manner of someone who had been given very specific instructions about what not to say. Voss noticed that the chamber nodded differently now, not in agreement necessarily, but in the way you nod when someone speaks, and you are no longer completely certain you understand the full shape of what they are capable of, when the easy confidence of the experienced is replaced by the more careful attention of people who have been surprised once and do not wish to be surprised again. It was not peace. It was not even close to peace. The Keth still had their empire and their ambitions, and their 117 worlds, and the 9,800 ships they had brought home. There would be more incidents. There would be more pressure. There would be conversations in this chamber that went nowhere, and nights when Voss would sit at her desk and wonder if the next fleet was already being built. But there would be no more laughing. Kos's report to Keth Command was classified at the highest level, but intelligence services being what they are, its basic conclusions leaked within months. The report said, in language that the Keth civilian press translated as carefully as possible, that humanity had demonstrated a capacity for long-term strategic preparation that was not reflected in existing intelligence assessments, that engagement with human forces in contested terrain required significantly greater resource commitment than modeling had predicted, and that further military operations against human systems should be considered only after comprehensive reassessment of all available intelligence. Comprehensive reassessment, 2 words that had never appeared in a Keth military report about humanity before. On Titan Station, Tanaka read the leaked summary and set it down. She looked at the wall of her office, which was bare except for a small star chart she had pinned there 8 years ago. The chart had a single notation on it, a cloud of gas and dust 40 light-years wide, labeled in her handwriting, Gravenmoor. She thought about what came next. The 8 years of preparation that had won this engagement did not solve the larger problem. They had bought time, not resolution. The Keth would reassess. They would build new models. They would try to account for what they had not accounted for before. They would try again, eventually, in some form. And she would need to be ready. She pulled out a new planning document and opened it. She wrote a date at the top, today's date, and a heading. She thought for a moment about what to call it. Then she wrote, Phase 2. She paused, looking at the words. Then, in the margin, she wrote something else. A note to herself, the kind she never let anyone else see. It said, They will not laugh twice. She underlined it once. Then she started writing. Outside Titan Station, in the darkness between worlds, the Gravenmoor Nebula turned slowly, lit from within by the faint glow of star formation, new suns being born from dust and gas and time. It looked, to anyone watching from a distance, exactly like what it was. A cloud, just a cloud. But it was also, now, something else. It was the place where 11,000 ships had come to end something, and had found instead that the thing they had come to end was only just beginning. It was the place where humanity had stopped laughing at itself long enough to make sure no one else would laugh either. It was Gravenmoor, and it would not be forgotten.